Hi, I'm Ken Fisher. Welcome to the 19th season of CityWide. My guest on this edition of CityWide is Iris Weinshall. She's the Chief Operating Officer of the New York Public Library. Welcome to CityWide.
Thank you, Ken. Pleasure to be here.
I think many New Yorkers, they think of the New York Public Library. Obviously, you have the iconic building on 42nd Street, and maybe there's a branch in somebody's neighborhood. But I suspect that most people really don't understand the size of the library, the complexity of the library. So what is the New York Public Library today?
So we are a rather large institution in New York City, and you talked about our iconic building on 42nd Street. That's only one building and one branch of the NYPL. We actually have 92 buildings and 92 facilities all over the Bronx, Manhattan, and Staten Island, because the NYPL, as you know, is responsible for those three boroughs. Queens and Brooklyn have their own library systems. And so we serve many different functions. We serve many different people throughout those three boroughs. We do have the premier research libraries here in the city of New York, public research libraries. So we have the main building on 42nd Street. We have the Schomburg Center up in Harlem, which is probably has the largest collection of African-American culture and books.
I didn't know that that was part of the New York Public Library.
You see, so now you've learned something on your show. We have the LPA, the Performing Arts Library at Lincoln Center, as well as we have the main research library on 42nd Street. But really, it's about the 88 branches throughout these three boroughs, which, if you ask me, are a crucial part of what the NYPL is all about, providing an opportunity for all New Yorkers to have free access to knowledge and to learning and to the type of resources that they may need in their day-to-day lives.
So how many books do you have?
Well, that's interesting. We have 45 million research materials, as well as we have close to 24, almost 25 million books that we circulate in our circulating library. So that'll give you a sense of how many books. In addition, we also lend ebooks. So 10% of the books that we lend every year are ebooks. So people can download books that they've borrowed from the New York Public Library.
And then what happens after a week? They disappear?
They have it for a certain period of time, and then it disappears. And so they have to be a fast reader and get through the book. But that market is growing for us, so they can download it on their iPhone or their iPad or their Nook, depending on what they want to read it on.
The word library conjures up sort of a fussy image. Where does the library fit in the internet? Isn't all information, everything that we need to know, available to our fingertips and accessible through Google, Wikipedia, without a librarian?
The answer is yes, and the answer is no. So a couple of facts about the library. Yes, we do provide free internet service if you come into a library. But this is an interesting statistic. 2.5 million New Yorkers do not have Wi-Fi at home because they can't afford the Wi-Fi. Yes, they could have a smartphone, but as we know, Wi-Fi is very expensive. So many New Yorkers come into the library to avail themselves of our free Wi-Fi. And there are a fair number of New Yorkers who, still take out books and still use books. But what are the libraries about today? So we are providing ESL classes.
English as a second language.
To new immigrants who have come to the city and are desperately trying to learn English. We're providing Tech Connect, teaching people how to use a computer, stuff that you and I take for granted and probably our kids could whiz through right away, but there are hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers who have really no knowledge of how to use a computer. And we're teaching computer classes in Spanish and in other languages so that we find that a lot of older immigrants are coming into the library to avail themselves of how to use computers. We're teaching resume writing classes for people so that they can hone their skills so that they can go out and look for jobs. We're providing educational programs for preschoolers, for little toddlers. We have reading hours, as well as we have a new program that we started a couple of years ago, OST, out of school time, where we work with high school students to be able to provide the type of support and services they need. So you're right, it's not totally about the books anymore, but we are providing hundreds of programs for New Yorkers and for immigrants here in the city.
So how many people use the library every year?
Well, so we've had about 17 million visits.
17 million people
17 million.
In your 88, 92 buildings,
yes.
Right?
And if you look at all the sporting events that happen in the city of New York, as well as all the visits to cultural institutions, visits to the libraries, even to this day, far exceed those visits to those institutions.
More people using the libraries than sports and culture combined.
Absolutely.
But those are always touted as economic development engines for the city. Cities gone out of its way to have tourists come here and have invested in Broadway, Theater District, Times Square, cultural institutions, museums, because it pays for itself in the long term. But the libraries are different. Does that make it harder for you to attract the kind of resources you need for your mission?
Not really. I mean, when you talk about great civilizations, great cultures, great cities, I mean, it's not just about economic development and the economic engine. It's about really providing the day-to-day services that people need and want, and really for a big part of the population we serve are so desperate for. So I would say, we're not shunning those other institutions, we're not shunning those other venues, but we really are about a society that really wants to provide the type of knowledge and access that all New Yorkers should have, and we believe and we know that we're providing for them.
New York is now more than 40% foreign-born. If you take children of immigrants, it's close to 50%. Probably the highest percentage since Andrew Carnegie was donating money for the libraries 100+ years ago.
Which, by the way, I just want to point out, this month, we celebrated the 114th anniversary of Andrew Carnegie's very generous and important gift to New York City.
What is different about serving an immigrant population, or since the library has always, served immigrants, what is different about serving an immigrant population that comes from many more places than it used to?
Well, let me just say from the outset that, in my job, I try and get to as many branches as possible. We have 88 branches. I want to say that I started the library in September. I think I've visited now 45 branches of the 88. My goal is by my first anniversary to visit all 88. Maybe a challenge, but I hope to make it. And so what strikes me when I walk into a branch is that immigrants and people who come from foreign countries feel safe in libraries. they're not, depending on what culture they've come from, they may not be so, how shall we say, safe about going to a government office. But a library is a safe place. It's a place where they know they will get information and help that will be uncensored, right? They can ask whatever they want. No one's taking notes. No one's taking their name. So first and foremost, the fact that immigrants feel safe and they feel secure in a library. As well as, you know, we have to provide services, and we have to have librarians who are cognizant of what people come from, what languages they speak. Now, clearly we can't. I think somebody once said something like 187 different languages are spoken in New York. You know, clearly even we can't provide that level of service. But we try, and so that is an example, in Chatham Square in Chinatown, we're going to have librarians that will speak various dialects of Chinese.
Right, it's not enough to just have one
right.
version.
You got to have a few dialects. Right. As well as in Washington Heights, you know, we're going to be sure to have librarians on staff who are going to speak Spanish and be able to help our patrons. You know, also, I would say that many of the immigrants coming in, and I mentioned this before, have not been exposed to computers, have not been exposed to the internet. And so, you know, we're finding that this is a big avenue that we can help get immigrants, you know, moved into becoming great citizens of New York City. And the last thing is that many of the immigrants need their help and our help in terms of getting their resumes together, looking for jobs, figuring out, you know, how do they get from point A to point B. And many of our librarians and many of our libraries are able to provide that service.
So finding that people feel that libraries are safe spaces for them is a positive thing that you've learned. What's been the most disturbing or shocking thing that you've discovered since you joined the library system?
Well, I guess for me, the most disturbing and shocking thing that I have uncovered is just the poor condition of our libraries. You know, we have 88 branches, you know, 4 great research libraries that we're very proud of, and just the range of conditions of the library. So, you know, you can go into a branch and the elevators aren't working. Or you can go into a branch, many of the Carnegie branches, which were built at the turn of the century, are not ADA compliant. So they'll have these steep steps that go up to the entrance, but there's no ramp, there's no elevator, there's clearly no escalator. And so I sort of scratch my head and say, well, if I was somebody in a wheelchair, how would I get into the library? I went to one library in the Bronx and I asked the librarian this, and she said, well, I have a few patrons and they come with lists of books that they want, and I meet them at the bottom of the steps and I take their lists for them, and then if we have the book, I'll take their library card and check it out. In this day and age, that should not be the case. Many of our libraries don't have sufficient space for the type of educational programs that I talked about. And so, you know, we're shifting around classes all during the day just to be able to accommodate the many needs. You go into some branches and, you know, all the bathrooms could be out because, you know, for whatever reason, the plumbing is bad. I went into one branch and the librarian showed me she had jerry-rigged. There was a leak coming in from the ceiling, and she personally had jerry-rigged so that the leak would come down through the basement. She showed me the piping she herself had put in. And I say to myself, in a day and an age in 2015, to be able to have those type of facilities is a little distressing and a little upsetting. And so that, to me, has been the biggest shock that I have really discovered in coming to the libraries. Now, I got to tell you, our librarians, they're a great workforce, and, you know, they are committed to what they're doing. They're committed to their patrons. And, you know, I go into libraries all the time, and I say to the library manager, don't just tell me about the facilities. Tell me about the programs you're running and the books that you're lending, and tell me what's going on. I'll worry about the facilities.
We're going to talk about how the libraries can get the resources they need to address some of these problems when CityWide continues right after this. Welcome back to CityWide. We're speaking with Iris Weinshall from the New York Public Library. So before the break, we were talking about the physical condition that the libraries are in. Obviously, public functions compete for resources. Why aren't the libraries in better shape, and what would get them into better shape?
So working with our partners in Queens and Brooklyn, we have come up with a 10-year capital ask in the 10-year capital plan.
That's unusual.
Well, it's unusual because up until this year, and I have to give kudos to the de Blasio administration, the libraries were not in the 10-year capital plan. And you as a former council member know that really, in order to plan for a large project, you need to be in a 10-year plan. And how the libraries were funded up until this point is we were funded year by year. So there was no long-term planning. So a particular councilman had, a good feeling toward one of his branches or her branches and would give money for a boiler or for windows or whatever. And so this year we were invited by the de Blasio administration to submit in the 10-year capital plan. And between the three systems, we have come up with an ask of about $1.4 billion, which would do three things. It would take care of a lot of the critical maintenance issues that I just talked about, the boilers, the lack of ADA, the lack of elevators. Each of the systems would have an opportunity to upgrade, soup to nuts, a certain number of branches. So we wouldn't have to do this piecemeal type of renovation. We could close the branch down and within a year and a half or 2 years just totally renovate the branch. And the third big ask has to do with technology because, as we talked about, there's such a great need for computers and for Wi-Fi and to be able to expand that use for people. So the ask covers all these areas, and now, as you know, because the budget season is in earnest, we will start to talk to the City Council and to the Mayor's office about what they can foresee for this ask.
Give me a context for a second, because you have been Commissioner of Transportation. You were a senior executive at the CUNY system itself. Is $1.4 billion in a 10-year capital plan, is that a lot of money?
It is a lot of money, and it is a lot of projects to get started. And I guess to answer your question, is it enough? No. I mean, of course, we would like more, but one has to be realistic. One has to be realistic in terms of what we can accomplish over that 10-year period. And as you also know, because you were a councilman, the first 5 years is what really matters, to be able to get those projects started and done.
So this may be a little bit awkward, but in looking at the capacity of the library system to spend that kind of money, recently there was a plan for the redevelopment of the 42nd Street branch that became controversial and then seemed to have fallen of its own weight. So I don't know to what extent this was before you got on board, but that doesn't exactly inspire confidence that there's going to be the focus that you need to be able to use those resources wisely.
So the central library plan, the plan that you talked about, is a totally different animal than having to renovate branches or do the type of critical maintenance work that you need to do in the branches. They are of a nature and a scope that are not really that large, although most people watching the show, if I said that it would cost us $20 million to renovate a branch from top to bottom, they would say, what is she talking about? That is a lot of money. And the type of critical maintenance projects that we're talking about, I believe that we at the NYPL would be able to get many of the projects both started and completed, at least initially during the first 5 years and then afterwards during the second 5 years. As to the central library plan, I'm glad you brought it up. As you noted, we have pivoted away from that plan that we had embarked upon, and we will be coming out with a new plan. And that plan, which has been, talked about, is that we would totally renovate the the Mid-Manhattan branch, which is our largest branch in Manhattan. And we are very appreciative. The de Blasio administration has kept in the capital plan the $150 million that was given to us a couple of years ago. And so we will totally renovate this 150,000 square foot branch in Manhattan. In addition, we have about 70,000 square feet in the main library on 42nd Street, and we would renovate that 70,000 square feet to do a few things. We would open the building more to the public. We would create an education corridor in that building. So we would bring grade school children in, we bring high school students in, and one of the goals is, and you talked about our collection, we have great treasures at the NYPL.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you because the main branch has been in the library in the headlines for another reason recently, and it's almost like the headlines were ripped from the script of a Law and Order episode. Allegations of missing rare books and questions about ownership, investigations. I know it's complicated and sensitive, but what I really wanted to know is, you've got all of these valuable books in the library. What's that all about? Is that just very successful hoarding, or do they serve some mission-driven function other than it's great to have them?
Well, first and foremost, the sign of a great society is to have, great books and great treasures. Our many treasures are used by people not only in New York, but they're used by people worldwide. So whether it's famous authors writing books, or whether it's just graduate students doing research, people are using our treasures day in and day out.
They want to come, they want to see it, they want to touch the original.
Yes, and one of the things that we're going to be embarking on at the NYPL, we've started this already, is digitizing many of the treasures so that you don't actually physically have to come to the library, but you will be able to go online and see a digitized version of whatever you need in terms of research, or you're just interested in a topic. So, we have many treasures. They are used. I wouldn't say all 45 million are being used at this moment, but we are a great resource. I mean, we're a great resource like the Library of Congress is, like the British Library is. We are up there with those great institutions.
It's the cultural heritage of the country, if not the world.
I would agree with you.
I was struck in thinking about the show that 10 years ago, the culture wars were very much about the libraries, not just in terms of what books you had on your shelves, but particularly access to the internet, filtering, people using the computers for things that may be inappropriate for young people or whatever. But that seems to have all gone away. Are those kinds of issues still something that keeps you up at night?
Well, yeah. I mean, you always are concerned about, what people are accessing, what they're doing. But
there's no political movement to restrict access.
Not anymore. Not anymore. I would say not.
Yeah, maybe it was just the novelty of computers
at the time.
At the time. What do you do about engaging the public in the effort to get you the resources that you need? And I know, Iris, you're going to talk about how people should be contacting their elected officials and so forth, but I want to say two things. One is that there are so many competing issues that seem to have urgency to them. And secondly, I think to some extent, residents, voters have developed calluses on their ears because they're overwhelmed, and particularly when you have a perennial problem like library funding, that it's the same thing year after year after year. So how do you overcome fatigue and focus on other priorities when you have to do a struggle like this?
Well, let me just say that the three systems are engaged now in a community engagement outreach to try and get people energized and concerned about their libraries. And, With the internet now, we're able to reach out to many of our patrons because they sign up. Either they sign up for programs or they sign up for books, or they say, you can have my email address. So we are reaching out to our patrons. And what we're saying to them is, if you have something that wasn't in the council when you were there, if you have a councilman who's doing participatory budgeting, why don't you put libraries on your list? And when he has a meeting, why don't you go down and talk about libraries? We're holding rallies at various libraries that have very important projects and programs. So, if we know that a branch does toddler reading, we're sure to be there and have a rally and get the elected officials down there. Yeah, if there's a branch that has a very large ESL program, we'll try and get people.
So if there's somebody watching this show and you could say to them, here's one thing that I want you to do if you're interested in the libraries, what would that be?
I think I would tell them that whether they email or they write or they know that their councilman is going to be somewhere, that they make it known that their library or their program is important to them and important to their everyday life. And in addition, they have to let the mayor know that libraries are important to them. Mayor de Blasio was very generous to the libraries last year. For the first time in 6 years, gave us $10 million that we had not had before. The previous 6 years, we had cuts all along. The mayor gave us $10 million. We need more. That's for our operating budget. And so what I would tell people is, write the mayor, tell him that was great, that was a good down payment, but the libraries need more.
And if you don't know how to contact your elected officials or the mayor, there's a librarian at the branch close to you that'd be happy to help you out. My thanks to Iris Weinshall, the Chief Operating Officer of the New York Public Library. I'm Ken Fisher. Thanks for joining us in this edition of CityWide. Send your comments and suggestions to CityWide at CUNY-TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016. Or contact us at CUNY.TV.